The Sustainable Voice, bringing you big successes from small places worldwide.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Sustainable Voice. This is your host, Ashish. I got a bit of a different topic. It follows along the theme that we've been talking about in terms of tourism transforming countries. This one hits a little bit closer to home, though. This is Sudan. Now, Sudan's not a place that has tourism, on the mass level, but I'll talk about that in a second. But it is a place that's close to me, and it's in the news right now because of a regime change and coup and civil unrest that's happening in Khartoum. So my mom is from Sudan. She was born and raised in Sudan. I visited there as a child. This was all something that all of our families on my father's side, my mother's side, all emigrated from India to within the British colony and within different colonies to countries in Africa. Me in Kenya, my other family members to Uganda, my mom's family to Sudan. I remember visiting here as a child and landing in Khartoum, flying from Nairobi, landing in Khartoum and driving out to Madni. And, it still is the benchmark for authentic experiences. In fact, everywhere that I go, this becomes my benchmark for what I look for authentic experiences. I want to draw a picture for you all. I was 4 years old, maybe 5. And we used to go all the time. We'd fly, visit my grandmother, visit my uncles, one of who is still there. And we would visit them, and we would basically go and we would drive out to a small town called Madni, about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours away. And we would pile at the back of this old pickup truck, and we would basically drive out, and we get stuck in the mud. And there was this huge hill that was made out of basically just mud. It was shaped from mud. And we would go climb to the top of this thing and just slide down, because there was a natural water reservoir that was going down this hill. And it's one of my most vivid memories as a child. I would go sliding down this hill, get back up, go sliding down this hill, and then we get back in the truck and we would drive back to the house, and we covered in mud and covered in water, and we'd be having a blast. It's that red clay mud that you can't get out of your nails, and you have it all over your face and whatnot. You're thinking, whoa, this is a face mask, before there was even one that was even called a face mask. So we would go back to the house. We'd all, pretty much get hosed off at the same time. There's this huge opening for a shower that, with our clothes on, we would just all jump in at the same time, turn the shower on, and we would basically go there and have fun. And then at night, we would take the mattresses, pull out onto the stars, to the ground, and look at the stars as we sleep. It was glamping before the term even existed. This was 1981, 82. It was starbeds before the concept even existed. And that was Sudan. So you can imagine all the feelings and all the emotion that one would feel. And I don't mean me, but I mean members of my family who are still tied closer to Sudan. When, first of all, the civil war happened and you had Sudan break off into 2 countries. And then you had, just unrest. And then you had sanctions, and you had borders closed. And, I say this because, every time somebody talks about countries, well, we can't have tourism there because of human rights, or because of this and because of that. I understand. I also need to share that there's a second side to that equation, and we have to see the full story. Because you see, if you look at the news right now, Sudan's back in the news, although not as prominent as it should be. You see, it's back in the news because there's a coup happening. Now the 2 generals that are in charge are at war, and hope, possibly the old regime is coming back into power, which some think is a good thing, like including my mother, some think is a bad thing. It just depends. But I think about my uncle. That's, he's there. He can't go anywhere. The borders with Kenya is closed. The border with Egypt is closed. All the neighboring countries, the border is closed. So you have to wait. And you have to wait. And it's close to home, because you start thinking about this and say, I think right away about a previous episode where I talked about the fact that we cannot pass judgment. We were talking about Peru at the time. This is closer to home. This is my family's backyard. You can't pass judgment. Yet when you watch the news or read the news, that's exactly what's happening. You start seeing that's exactly what you see happening in the news. And it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's just different, right? And that's a key part of this, is the fact that we have to understand, first of all, what's happening. We have to secondly understand why it's happening. And thirdly, we have to think about what happens next, right? This is so important. This is absolutely important because the debate is not about whether or not there should be a regime change. The debate isn't even about why this is happening. This is nothing new. There's some great movies out about people who have left Sudan as refugees to come to countries. Members of my own family that have come to the U.S. as refugees. It's not like we're not talking about this utopian state that everybody loves and should go back to. But I think about some of the countries that we have covered on this podcast, from Colombia to Uganda to to Sri Lanka to even Kenya to a lesser degree. But you think about countries where if I had told you 60 years ago or 50 years ago that we were going to have tourism in Rwanda, you'd look at me and say, what? Well, first of all, the names were different, but really, what? You'd have tourism there? If I told you back just after 94, 95, after that gruesome genocide that happened in Rwanda, we're going to have tourism here, you'd look at me and say, what? Come on. No. If I told you in the 90s we were going to have tourism in Colombia, you'd look at me and say, what? Come on, look what's happening there. So why is Sudan any different? If I were to tell you today that we're going to have tourism in Sudan in the future, or we're going to have tourism in Venezuela, your reaction, rightfully so, should be, what? No, come on, let's slow down a little bit. You're off your rocker, maybe you're off your meds, whatever the case may be. But think about this. Think about what I'm saying. You see, when you start talking about the fact that what's happening maybe needs to happen, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, that's a different debate, but it's happening. But when you watch the news, it's in the cycle for all the wrong reasons. It's sensationalized until a political story comes out, or until a story about somebody being sued comes out, or a story about somebody going to jail, or sadly in our society, a story about something happening at a school comes out. The whole story is not being told. I was actually watching this the other day. I won't mention the network, but I was watching this the other day where I saw this cycle coming through, and it was just an anchor on TV talking about what's happening there. And it was maybe a 2-minute segment. No experts, no commentary, no debate, no explanation, just this is what's happening, this is the case. And the very next story, I kid you not, the very next story was about a celebrity and what they were wearing at a particular gala. That was the next story. Really? Really? If this was something that happened in a well-known country, or an accepted country, or in a Western country, or in a country that was more established, you could have debate. You could have all sorts of things happening back and forth, right? You could have a conversation. But because the people telling you the story know a little bit about it, all of a sudden, it's a quick story. Let me tell you what I know, which is limited, and then let me move on. However, for you as the viewer or the reader or the listener, it's not necessarily the best idea, right? Or the best solution, which is why we're not going to focus in on what the situation is. Like I said, it is what it is. I urge you to do your own research and form your own conclusions without passing judgment, which is what we talked about with Peru, right? So without passing judgment, you can see what's happening. But let's talk about the fact that we need to understand the true facts. You need to form your own conclusions. You need to actually have your own basis of understanding, your own basis for why you believe this is happening. I get this often whenever we hear about some of the scariest people in history, from Adolf Hitler to Idi Amin to Slobodan Milosevic. The phrase I keep hearing again and again and again is, we can't repeat history. Yet we still do. We can't repeat history. We can't repeat. You think about this. When you start hearing this, well, we can't repeat what's happening there. In order to not repeat history, we have to learn from history. In order to learn from history, we have to see what's unfolding in front of us and actually see it unfold and understand why it's unfolding, and form our own conclusions based on complete facts, not incomplete information. The one truth through all of this, and it's been proven by Uganda, by Rwanda, by Colombia, by Sri Lanka, you name it, by Egypt, by Morocco, by South Africa, by Peru, by Chile. You think about this and you go across the board, by Vietnam, by Cambodia, I can keep going, the list is there. But you think about this, the one true thing that is held true across the board, and it holds true here, it could be 10 days from now, 10 years from now, 10 decades from now, is that tourism done right, sustainable tourism, actually transforms these destinations. Look at what it's done to the countries I just mentioned and countless more. Look at what it's done. The World Travel Tourism Council says that 1 out of every 10 jobs comes from tourism. The reason we don't know that is because no one country calculates this aggregate properly, especially the countries that are wealthy. They don't calculate this properly. It was laid bare during the pandemic when you saw these extreme job losses, countries going from 12.5%, 13% unemployment to 62% unemployment in a matter of 3 months. It was laid bare because policy was made without understanding the true ramifications of tourism. Now, when I say tourism, I'm not talking about crowded beaches and countries and over-tourism. I'm talking about sustainable tourism, socially responsible tourism done right, which is what we've always talked about on this podcast. I'm talking about tourism that transforms countries. It's been proven and laid itself to be true across the board in the countries I mentioned to you, and like I said, countless more that are there. So in order to learn from history, we have to see it unfolding in front of us and say, yes, it's happening. Why is it happening? And what happens next? We're so focused on this is what's happening. This is why it's happening. Maybe we get that far. Nobody ever talks about what happens next. Think about this. When you look at Colombia's history, you see the obvious history. The gap between when that period ended and when tourism was taken seriously was almost 10 years. Think about that. The gap in a country like Vietnam, and I remember this clearly, Vietnam and Cambodia, the gap between when the disturbing period ended to when tourism started was almost 40 years, 30 years. And I know that because I remember talking about these places and I got laughed out of more places that I could think of when I would just go to random people and say, you have to think about this country for tourism. Oh, get out of here. Come on, no. I remember back in 2006, I was telling people Colombia is a sleeping giant. Watch what happens. Oh, come on. I remember in 2002 telling people Vietnam is a sleeping giant. Cambodia is a sleeping giant. Don't lose sight of that. Oh, come on. You got to be kidding. And that was the best part. Who would want to go there? Mark my words now. I'm telling you about Sudan. I'm telling you about this place. Now, granted, I think some of you listening are probably going to say, wait a second, what about the human rights violations? Well, I can't visit there because of human rights and everything else. Okay. But you've been to Uganda. You've been to Myanmar. I'm just saying. You've been to Chile. You've been to all these other parts of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. I'm just saying. The same debate's holding true in Saudi Arabia right now, right? What do we go? Do we not go? What about human rights? What about tolerance? All valid arguments. I'm not saying they're not valid. All I'm simply saying is you have to have complete information. We can't get on a high horse and say, I'm not visiting this country because they have human rights violations and because they don't believe in human rights, they don't believe in human rights, and then turn around and visit a country like Myanmar. Or turn around and visit a country like Uganda. I'm not saying it because that's just not true. The period where Myanmar was open for tourism, you could see how much their economy flourished. Let's take Aung San Suu Kyi out of the equation for a second. Let's take her and the genocide of the Muslims in Myanmar aside for a second, because that is a separate issue altogether. This is not for political debate. This is more for you to think about the fact that we pass judgment when we should be wondering how tourism fixes these things. You want to understand this, then we have to do what the World Travel Tourism Council says. We have to figure out what the proper aggregate is for tourism employment. 1 in 10 jobs on average worldwide. 1 in 10 jobs. Think about that. That's why I bring up Sudan. Think about this for a second. What if Sudan had tourism? And I'm going to explain to you why I'm thinking this, why I'm saying this, okay? But what if Sudan had tourism? What if Sudan actually did have some form of tourism? And what if this was prevented? What if the political stability of the country was necessary to keep tourism as a major driver of the economy, creating 1 in 10 jobs in that country? Would we still be dealing with a coup? And if we did, would it be as violent as it is? Would we still be dealing with that civil war? Would we still be dealing with what's happening in South Sudan in terms of genocide? Would we still be dealing with that? Nobody knows the answer. And I'm sure many of you listening right now will say this is maybe one of the most polarizing episodes I've recorded, but that's because this is a bit close to home. So a lot of this is coming off the cuff, but it's not different than what I've always believed in and what I've said in the previous episodes. So it's something that's very, very true. I had an amazing conversation with somebody who I hope to be a future guest in our podcast just a few days ago, where we talked about the transformation of tourism in countries and talked about women's empowerment within these countries and what it means. And it was an enlightening conversation. And I've asked her to be a guest, which she hopefully will be later on in the next episode or the episode after. It's a huge part of what we're doing and what we believe and what we're talking about. It's an illustration because the person who did this research and talks about this, the fact that she is coming on and sharing research, she's actually helping to prove certain points that we've talked about. This is one of them, right? This is key. Now, let's come back to the tourism Sudan port thing for a second. Okay, let's just come back to that for a second, because I think it's important to understand that, I guess, is the right word. You know, when we think about tourism in Sudan, I'll take you back to a few years back, and I actually met with this Italian company, just sitting down, talking, met them by chance at a conference somewhere. I don't know if it was in Morocco or if it was in Italy, in France. I can't remember where it was, but it was such an enlightening conversation because they were talking about running tours to Sudan and running, desert tours and what it was like. And I started looking at some of their pictures going, I know that area. And they started talking about all the different cultures and tribes and different aspects and the history that, some of it you could start seeing dates back to prehistoric times, to ancient Egypt, for example, to all those areas. And they started talking about this. And I thought about it again when I was driving from the airport in Abu Simbel to the temples of Ramses back in November. And I'm passing by these ports, and all these ferries are going full to Sudan with goods meant to go there because of a trading agreement made with the two. Or when football, soccer is being played, and when the rivalry is on and whatnot. There was some level where Sudan was accepted into society because there was a public connection. There was an external connection. That was to trade. Well, tourism is a form of that trade, right? So again, done right. And I remember when I was talking to this Italian company, the owner of the company, her eyes were lighting up because she was talking about this. And my eyes were lighting up because all the things that she was talking about is stuff that I remember the country. I'm like, I used to look at her pictures and go, I remember being there. I remember doing that. I remember that. I remember doing that. I was a kid, but that's a vivid memory. Oh yeah, I remember that hill there. I remember this drive there. Oh yeah, I was there. It was fantastic. And then I said, but what about what's happening there? She goes, what about it? Because if you want to change this country, sitting back and waiting for it to change is never going to be the answer. That's actually pretty accurate, right? You want proof of that? Go ask anybody who was working in tourism in Colombia in 2006 that was asking for a change, and ask them what steps were taken by the country, radical steps to be able to bring tourism in, steps that were a huge risk, but they yielded amazing results. But there was a crossroad that had to be reached first. So here we are at that same crossroad again, right? And I remember we were talking about the fact that, just in general, these countries that don't necessarily, shouldn't have tourism, Uganda, Rwanda, Colombia, these are modern miracles. How they actually got tourism is beyond me, but a bold first step was taken. And you know what didn't happen? There wasn't a judgment passed, right? And when it first opened, everybody was like, no, I don't want to go there. Even today, When I bring up Colombia today, it's, oh, really? You want to go to Colombia? Why? But then when they see what's there, all of a sudden their eyes open up. I didn't know. I had no idea. I had no clue that was there. All I knew of Colombia is what I see on Netflix or what I see streaming on different channels or what I've read about or what I've been told. But that's just one city. That's one region. That's another, maybe two regions. What about the rest of the country? What about the majority of the population that actually do want you to visit? Same thing here. My time I was being there, when I was there, it wasn't like it was, big, scary people that were, that were threatening me every day. Quite the opposite. I would walk into markets when I was in Sudan. I would walk in with my mother and walk in with not. And of course, there were rules for how to behave in public as I was a kid. But I remember walking through and tasting some of the best fruit that was out there. And my grandmother talking about what it was like living there, and what it was like when they first got there, and just how peaceful it is. And now the fact that there are no mosquitoes where we were, and that you could, leave your door unlocked and nobody would come in, or you could put your bed on the ground and sleep under the stars and see everything in the sky. Or the fact that you could smile and it would be something normal. It would be part of the day that you'd just be able to smile and have fun. And we weren't visiting any sites, although there were a ton there. It was just adventure. It was just fun. That was the key thing. That was the beauty of what I'm talking about, right? In terms of this, we have to think about this. I mentioned this earlier, just in this episode. We talked about countries getting blacklisted. That country's blacklisted. Nobody should go here. When Sudan is, let's face it, they're blacklisted. If I ask any of you about going to Sudan, you would say the same thing. But if I told you about going to Cuba, you would consider it. If I told you about going to Rwanda, Uganda, oh yes, I'm ready to go. To Myanmar. Okay, when things slow down, when things get back, get back into place, sure. What do you mean by get back in place? Yes, of course, right now you can't go. But the junta was in power when tourism was happening in Myanmar. It wasn't like it was a completely different regime. The junta was in power. There was a brief period with Aung San Suu Kyi, but the junta was in power. And they're back in power. I'm not saying I agree with how they run. What I'm saying is that if we were going to judge a country based on the government that's in charge as to whether or not tourism should be there, well, then that pretty much leaves maybe a handful of countries to visit, and that's it. And if that's the case, then I feel sad for you, right? I feel sad for all of us, because then all we're doing is building up these huge borders and huge barriers around us, and we're not going to learn anything. And then we're going to succumb to things like racism and ethnocentrism and everything else that comes in, right? But we don't need to. We're a more educated species, right? Not the smartest, for sure. There's definitely smarter species, but we're an educated species. We're better than that. We have to process information and be able to make our own decisions. So this is not about, and this is not about saying, well, let's create a rally for Sudan. I'm not saying that. I'm saying what I've said in previous episodes when talking about what was happening in Peru. Please form your own judgment. Please take all the information and form your own judgment. And let me know what you think, right? But I'm willing to believe that if a country like Colombia and Rwanda and Uganda and Myanmar and Sri Lanka and Peru and Chile, the list goes on and on and on and on and on. South Africa, if those countries can actually have a second chance, and tourism represented that second chance. And today, in many of those countries, tourism is the only sector that's actually working properly when everything else is failing. Then shouldn't a country like Sudan be seen in that way? Shouldn't a country like Venezuela be seen in that way? Right? It's what comes next. It's not why that's part of it. It's not where that's part of it. It's what comes next. South Africa is a great example. I was talking to somebody just probably a year and a half ago about South Africa. I talked about Nelson Mandela. Well, he's a terrorist. Okay, in certain eyes. He did act in a certain way, so maybe in certain eyes. But what about the incarceration? What about the fact that the man became the future president of the country, and the fact that the country sorely misses him right now? You could see it. What about the fact that same man hoisted up the World Cup trophy when the FIFA World Cup was in South Africa? What about that? Right? What about that? So what I'm saying is that countries are allowed to transform. They have the ability to transform. Why do they do it, right? Nelson Mandela talked about the fact that South Africa needs to be open to foreign investment, be an attractive beacon for foreign investment. Some areas succeeded better than others, but the fact that it was open versus what it was before. This is a country that practiced apartheid. This is a country that practiced segregation in a way not seen even since the Civil War or before in this country, practiced in that way. And yet, here we are. So if that country can transform, if a country like Rwanda that had genocide, the levels of which few have seen, could transform, then why can't Sudan? If a country like Uganda can transform from what it was in the days of Idi Amin, also close to home because of my extended family that was there in terms of in Uganda, and the fact that they were exiled by Idi Amin, why can't Sudan? If a country like Chile that can transform from their days, if a country like Peru can transform from their days, and I don't mean the recent past, I mean the history. These countries transformed because they were allowed to. And that's a key part of this equation, right? It's something that we have to understand. So you've heard me say what comes next. Well, what does come next? Well, here's what I believe. First of all, when I was visiting Sudan, it was all about sanctions, and that's still happening today. Desperate people aren't going to be afraid of desperate measures, right? I mean, let's face it. Take a look what's happening in the world. Sudan are desperate people. And I don't mean the political side. I mean the people you don't know about, the people you don't meet, the people that you see in the streets, the people that actually talk to you. You can't take somebody who's already desperate and make them more desperate. You have to be able to give them a path forward. In the case of Colombia, it was taking drug farmers and putting them to work in tourism. In the case of Peru, it was actually liberating the farmers and then being able to bring tourism in. In the case of, in the case of Uganda, it was regime change. Rwanda was regime change. It was actually then going in and showing, again, a beacon for foreign investment. South Africa, same thing. That's what comes next. That's what comes next. You have to look at the fact that tourism is really, after this is all said and done, the only part of the economy in Sudan that would work perfectly. Everything else is probably going to malfunction. So you need some way forward. If your social services have all fallen apart, which they will, if they haven't already, which you can see right now, then the only path forward is the one that works. You want proof? Take a look at Zimbabwe. We're not that far removed from Mugabe being in charge there, and look at Zimbabwe now. There's foreign investment coming in from all over. Beautiful safari camps opening up and sustainable in nature. They're becoming the next beacon for tourism. In some parts, they already are. And I'm talking about beyond Victoria Falls. There's a future here, right? There's a future that's here. And it's one that has to be addressed. But it can only be addressed if we're asking the right questions. We have to let what's unfolding unfold. And then once it does unfold, then the next step is to be able to explore how we can bring tourism here. I admired that Italian company was doing it. I don't know where they are now, but I admired what they were doing because they were one in a million. I admired them because of what they saw. Yeah, I was probably biased because of what because Sudan's my benchmark, but I still admired them. And that's really key. That's something that's so important to understand. We must understand that. We must think about this, that we can't judge these countries. When you look at countries that have civil unrest and social unrest, countries that are either young democracies, countries that aren't even democracies, but countries that have had tourism for maybe a brief period or a lengthier period, we have to focus on what comes next. We can't just pass judgment on what's happening right now and go, oh, poor people. I hope they figure it out. No, they're not going to. They're not going to unless there's an outside voice, right? And that outside voice is not the United Nations. The outside voice is not the IMF. The outside voice is not lending the money. The outside voice is it actually comes from within. A path forward. That's a responsibility of our world leaders. You want to fix all of that, you have to go back to, again, aggregate, figuring out and having every country, starting here at home, every country has to properly calculate the amount of their GDP that comes from tourism, the amount of employment that is generated by tourism in all forms, right? So you're not just talking about direct in terms of tourism directly, but indirect, right? With hotels and cars and food, there's a lot of indirect connections as well. You got to take the whole thing. What is the power that tourism has in driving an economy? Here we are, 2 years past the pandemic. And I say past loosely, and we still haven't figured it out. That's the first step. We must figure out the aggregate contribution tourism has worldwide. Only by having hard statistics and hard facts can then our world leaders sit down and say, this hard fact proves this is your path forward. It'll happen at some point. It happened in Vietnam, it happened in Cambodia, it happened in all the countries I mentioned. It'll happen. It may just not be as quickly as we want. Till next time, I'm Ashish.
Thank you for listening to The Sustainable Voice. If you have a success story of your own, please reach out and share it with us. Would love to hear from you. See you next time.